Weirding Way Media.
Hello and welcome to episode 125 of the Filmumentaries Podcast. I'm Jamie Benning, and this episode is a bit of a milestone. Not only is it the 125th episode, but it also marks 5 years since I launched the podcast. A huge thank you to all of you who've been listening, sharing and supporting along the way. And who better to celebrate this milestone with me than the legendary Walter Murch, a returning guest, I think the most frequent one. Him and Doug Weir, maybe, of the BFI. Walter is a true philosopher, practitioner of cinema, an Oscar-winning editor and sound designer whose curiosity spans from celluloid to neuroscience. And this time we speak about his new book, Suddenly Something Clicked, which Faber Faber were kind enough to send me an early preview copy of, thanks to Walter prompting them. And I'm very grateful to Walter and to the folks at Faber Faber for that. The book is actually out on the 8th of May, and as you'd expect, it's full of the kind of insights that only Walter can offer, weaving together practical advice, film history, science, and the subconscious magic of cinema, that stuff that we love so much. We covered so much ground in this interview. It's a long one, so strap in. We talk about biological editing metaphors, to the surreal memory of misidentifying Carl Schultz on a New York street with George Lucas. Walter even shared some thoughts on AI, single-shot dramas, and how sound can be used most powerfully in a metaphorical sense. So here's my third conversation with Walter Murch on this special 125th episode of the Filmumentaries Podcast, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on, and for some big news, or a little tease of some big news anyway. Walter, I appreciate you joining me again. It's always great to have you on the podcast. I think this is the third time. You might even be the most... have you been here the most out of all of my guests? You may have done, actually. You're to me, you're like this philosopher, practitioner. You're a rare combination of technician, artist, and thinker. I was trying to work out how best to describe you. I think that's the best that I've come up with. You think like a scientist. You kind of edit like a musician. And you write like a philosopher. I love the new book, Suddenly Something Clicked. What was the sort of feeling behind making this book? Like, obviously, Blink of an Eye continues to kind of resonate with filmmakers and students today. So many people love that book. What prompted you to return to the page with this book? Was there a sense that the landscape had changed enough and the thinking had shifted in a way that called for a different kind of reflection?
Yeah, I think I've been working in film in one form or another for 6 decades, and the first 3 decades were analog, and it was at the end of that period that I wrote In the Blink of an Eye. So there have been 3 additional decades now, which have been all where I've worked all digitally. So that was part of the consideration. The other one was simply a prompting from Walter Donahue, the film editor at Faber Faber, and he approached me a number of years ago and said, "How about another book?" And I thought, sure. And one thing led to another.
You've always had this kind of rare ability, I think, to articulate the kind of paradoxes of cinema. There's sort of certainties and there's mysteries. And in this book, you sort of present both those sides of an idea as potentially true. Do you see this as a kind of essential mindset for artists and editors in particular?
Yeah, I mean, cinema is very new
Mm.
in human experience compared to all of the other things that we do. All of the other arts, the origins are lost in prehistory. And as Bela Balash says, cinema is the only art whose birthday is known to us. And it's been around roughly for the length of one very, very long human lifetime, 120 plus years. Um, so we're still discovering things about it, as you would expect. And if you have the 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 kind of the bend of mind, which I guess I do, you can look at it as this grand experiment in human perception. What is it, and to put it bluntly, what can we get away with? In the same sense that a magician has to know what the magician can get away with in terms of tricking human perception to believe certain things and disbelieve certain other things. And in that sense, cinema is a kind of magic trick. And it's appropriate that one of the founders of cinema, Georges Méliès, was a magician, and many others as too. They were immediately attracted to the medium because of its similarity with magic. And I guess magic is an old art that we've been practicing for, I don't know, let's say 10, 20,000 years. Who knows what it is? But yeah, it's also that I almost uniquely, maybe not quite, I straddle two different universes in film, in that I'm both a film editor and a sound designer. In parenthesis, I've also written and directed films. So I have many kettles on the boil, and that allows me to see things from slightly different perspectives, which I guess encourages that kind of philosophical outlook.
Mm. It's funny you mentioned that the magic angle. One of my most recent guests, Jeff Oken, is a producer and a VFX supervisor, and he started off as a magician and sort of doesn't see that there's a disconnect between the two. He sees it as a continuation, really. He kind of always regrets that he didn't become a sort of, fully fledged magician performing in front of people. But in many ways, that's what his job entails. Because, I've spoken to people like Ken Ralston who experimented in VFX with things like, putting a potato on screen instead of like an asteroid in The Empire Strikes Back, or putting a tennis shoe in a shot when it should have been a spaceship. It's all about that kind of tricking our subconscious to kind of believe what we're seeing. And I think all the way you bring, sound, you bring your sort of directorial understanding, you bring science. It's just amazing to me how you can go in one chapter from this intensely practical kind of approach to then the philosophical and even then the neurological. One page might be a hands-on tip about editing rhythm, and the next will reference saccadic eye movement and the subconscious. Do you see filmmaking and especially editing, as sitting in that intersection between, I guess, craft and cognition?
Yeah, that was one of the pitches that I gave to Walter Donahue at the beginning of the project, apart from the fact that he initiated the idea of writing the book. But he said, "Can you just write a paragraph of what the book will be like?" And I said, "It's going to be a twisted rope with three strands in it. One of them is theory, the other one is practice, and another one would be history." And I guess in addition to theory, you could talk about the neurology of what's going on, and that's actually how it turned out to be. And so I jump from one thing to another, um, but that's as the cowboys used to say, that's the kind of hairpin that I am. It's also that I'm 80 now, approaching 82 years old. And at that age, you also tend to look back on not only your own life, but the life of cinema.
Mm.
And, if we could say that, I am going frequently out on a limb and saying that cinema wasn't invented until the invention of editing, until we understood that you could break up the image into short clips, and then you could reorganize that like a mosaic, uh, a mosaic of two dimensions of space and one of time. That cinema motion photography had been invented, but cinema um, hadn't been invented, and that means both the practical nature. If I mean, imagine the dilemma of trying to make a film in 1904 without editing. It just there's a huge limit to that. And so it meant that we could break down a screenplay, a scenario, into fragments, and then we could reorganize those fragments into the most efficient shooting schedule, taking account of weather and the availability of certain props and actors, and whether it's an interior or all of those things. Uh, it made it conceivable to shoot a film of great length and ambition. And then the editing itself allowed, with the invention of continuity editing, somebody running out of one shot and running into the next shot. But wait a minute, the second shot was actually photographed before the first shot, but nobody cares. And then adding on top of that I guess what you'd call the Kuleshovian editing of banging one concept of an image right up against another one and presenting that to an audience as a challenge and a question. That these are huge advances in the grammar of cinema, and we've just continued to investigate all of those avenues.
Yeah, that grammar of film, like as you say in the book, is once unknown, whereas children today, of course, grow up kind of intuitively understanding cinematic language, especially now that screens are shoved in front of children from a very young age. Do you think that language is learned through that exposure, or do you lean towards the idea that it's somehow like a pre-existing hardwired thing in our perception?
I think it's both. In early days, Jean-Claude Carrière, the French screenwriter, learned from Louis Buñuel, who was a collaborator, that in the early days of cinema in Spain, there had to be someone sitting or standing to one side of the screen who was called an explicador, an explainer. And this was in the days of silent films, and he would provide a running commentary of, what are you looking at now? So this is this is a close-up of somebody, and now we're going to cut to what that person is looking at. And because the audiences in the very early days of film were people probably in their teens or late 20s, 30s, who knows, but they had grown up without cinema, and now they were being exposed to it. 30 years later, you didn't have to explain it anymore because the audience had already become familiar with all of the tropes of cinema. But I think a more profound level is that much of the grammar of cinema has evolved out of the grammar of dreams, and been dreaming, who knows, for many, many millions of years. And so, in a sense, we are recreating a dreamscape in one form or another when we make a film, and we just have to allow the audience the freedom to tap into that. And it took a while for people to understand that we could do this, because the very earliest films, the trope that they were imitating was theatrical, that it would be a one big wide shot and you would see people in full figure like you would see them on stage, and they'd be doing things. And as valuable as that was, it wasn't really digging into the potentialities of what has ultimately come to be.
Yeah, I love that recurring thread throughout the book, the kind of biology of cinema and how it links with our biology. Do you think the part of what makes editing kind of work viscerally is that it mirrors something deeper that we have in our biological processes? Because there's there's one chapter where you're linking the kind of scientific with the kind of artistic, the DNA and the RNA link. I won't go too deep into that. I mean, it's a hell of a chapter. I had to read it a couple of times to fully understand it. But just I always love the way that you strive to link kind of science and art. Is there something deeper that we have biologically that helps us kind of process edited films efficiently, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, at the first level, it's that what we were just talking about, the grammar of dreams. Remember that frequently when you dream, you see yourself in your dream. It's in a kind of over-the-shoulder shot, almost literally sometimes. And of course, you in real life have never seen yourself in an over-the-shoulder shot. From the moment you wake up, you remove the lens cap of sleep, so to speak, and the single shot, a roving point of view shot for 16 hours. And then, boom, you put the lens cap back on, you sleep for 8 hours. But dreams are not that. Dreams are not single point of view stuff, which is all that your whole experience of reality has been a single point of view experience. But dreams are not that. We have wide shots, we have over-the-shoulder shots, we have drone shots, flying shots, everything. That's that. The chapter you're referring to is something I didn't expect to write. It's one of the wonderful things about the process is starting out on something and then suddenly getting hijacked by a subject matter and thinking, wait a minute, what's going on here? And it's I won't say too much about it, but it's triggered by the discovery within the last couple of decades of a protein complex in the nucleus of every cell on Earth, except for bacteria. But, pine trees have it, we have it. Mushrooms have it. And there's this protein complex called the spliceosome. You can kind of see where this is going. And it takes the copy of the DNA that's made to ultimately to make a new protein. And it looks at it and literally says, there's some bad stuff in here which I have to get rid of, and there's some good stuff, but I can put the good stuff in a better order than it was in the DNA. And it does that using these, what we now call CRISPR scissors, and it reknits the DNA, which is now called RNA, this copy, and pats it on the shoulder and says, off you go. And this little strand of spaghetti wiggles through the wall of the nucleus out into the larger cell, and then it is in turn attacked. That's the only word I can use, by another protein complex called the ribosome that says, okay, I'm going to make a protein out of this ticker tape, basically. It's exactly what's going on, and it does. So without the intervention of this spliceosome, if that copy of the DNA was made without re-editing it, nonsense would come out. And, if you look at the original negative of a film, you see the parallels, because in the original negative, or the digital equivalent of that, there's lots of nonsense in it. Stuff that's out of focus, or the clapstick, which you don't need, and then runouts, and who knows what else, failed stunts. They all have to be purged by the editor in order to make a coherent film, and that's exactly what's going on inside every one of the trillions of cells in your body as we are doing this interview. So it's thrilling realization to realize this almost exact similarity. So how does that happen? That's another mystery that we're beginning to uncover.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating concept. I mean, it kind of blew me away. I just had to go back to the start of the chapter and start reading it again because, part of my job as an editor is I'm a live editor, so I'm taking stuff and editing it very quickly to get it back out to air in sports productions and live events and things. And that's something we do like on an instinctive level. I'm not even intellectualizing it. As I'm doing it, there's just that feeling of what is right and what is wrong. I love that you take those kind of physical moments in editing that have always existed, particularly in the sort of analog age, because I think some people assume that now the analog age is over and we're into the digital age, that you just kind of dismiss all of the kind of things that came before. But you talk in the book about physically screening dailies, printing out scripts, annotating scripts, writing your notes and stuff and all of that sort of, and even like the posture and the physicality in editing. Do you think something gets kind of cognitively or creatively lost when we kind of lose these practices and we're replaced by kind of purely digital ones?
Yeah, I mean, we're deep into the digital age now, and we're beginning to sort of dip our toe into artificial intelligence. Where that's going to go is another mystery that will be revealed. But yeah, it's very much the same kind of paradox that in the old days, you had a map, a physical piece of paper, and you had to, if you were driving somewhere, you had to figure out where you were on that map using coordinates and things that you saw on the landscape and everything. Now you just turn on GPS and it tells you what to do. So I'm glad that I experienced the analog world because it rearranged certain or arranged certain patterns in my brain that are still there and still active. But by the same token, when we teach people to drive, we don't teach them, okay, you're going to have to learn how to drive on a Model T Ford in order to understand how things, we just don't do that, and nor should we do it. It's interesting and curious, and stuff can be learned from it. But on a practical level, we live in the GPS world now, and that's just how it is. And it's not going to go away unless there's some cataclysm.
Yeah, one of my friends said his ex-wife was so used to the GPS that she put it on just to go to Tesco's, which was literally turn left, turn right, turn left, because we come to rely on these things. I love that chapter about the Moviola. I've seen the film as well, which I supported with Howard and yourself and Mike Lee in it. You talk about in the chapter about the Moviola, her name was Moviola, the film, that you were kind of surprised at how quickly that muscle memory returned, those kind of big physical acts as opposed to these small kind of mouse and keyboard acts. Do you think, how surprised were you, and how quickly did it come back? Was it a matter of just having the kit in front of you and putting your hands on it, or did it take a matter of hours or days even?
It was instant.
Really?
There was not the slightest hesitation. And well, why is that? My experience, and this is an experience shared by everybody who works in editing, is that if you're working on a film using a certain brand of software, and then the film is over, and you go to some island in the South Seas and you loll about for a couple of months, and then you come back and here's a new film, and you start using exactly the same piece of software that has not been updated. It takes a couple of days or a week until you're really comfortable with it, because the basic things, but a lot of the more recondite commands have evaporated. Whereas with the moviola system, nothing evaporated. It was all present. And I think that's because of its extreme physicality and because there's a huge difference between rewinding a reel and making a cut. Whereas digitally, those are just two minor differences in which keystrokes you're using. Plus the fact that in your daily life, when you're not editing a film, you're sending emails and you're on TikTok and you're still doing the same kind of little things with your fingers. So there's a pollution that enters in where everything gets kind of cross-referenced and it's easy to get confused. Whereas in your daily life back 50 years ago, there was nothing in your experience like rewinding a reel, Plus, it made a weird sound, and some of the stuff you did with chemicals had a certain smell. So there was a wide cross-sensory thing that really baked in those impressions.
Yeah, it's interesting how I've really felt a lot of what you were saying links to my world. I mentioned it earlier. So I'm what's called in the TV industry an EVS operator editor. So EVS is a Belgian company that makes these big video servers that can record multiple channels of video. So it's often used for things like doing replay, building highlights, building packages that go to air very, very quickly. Now, this system has been around since the late 90s. And basically stayed the same, apart from a few software changes. But the physical nature of it, there's a remote controller, there's a jog wheel, and there's a lever for speed, and there's a bunch of buttons to store clips in. That stayed the same for more than 25 years and is only now kind of being reinvented in the last couple of years. It's interesting how all of the systems that have tried to replicate it have always gone down that same route of kind of, the jog wheel and the lever and a series of buttons in roughly the same place, because experimenting with a mouse and a keyboard doing that job, you don't actually have a sort of visceral understanding of the passage of time that one turn of that jog wheel takes. And you don't have there's a clutch built into it as well. So you can't play it and rewind it at the same time. So you hear a click. So when you cue it up at some point and let's say roll a replay, it clicks and you get this little kind of, tangible, visceral feedback. Some of the competitors didn't include that in their system. And it wasn't until we realized that it wasn't there, how important it was, just some of those little key indicators. And we're probably never going to go to a system where we have a mouse and a keyboard to do those operations, because you need those kind of big physical movements to kind of, I don't know, it just becomes natural. I don't ever find using a mouse and a keyboard natural as such. But yeah, some interesting parallels to my world. You also, and we kind of touched on it already, you evoke that beautiful sort of image of letting things percolate, that moment in a screening where you make a note and then have some distance to help sort of clarify. You seem to have these strategies to kind of deliberately not solve something too quickly, which I kind of admire in this modern day where we're responding to text messages instantly, and I think emails are checked within 9 seconds of them arriving on average. Is that something that you always strive to do, to allow yourself to sort of have these subconscious influences on your work?
Sure, but it also goes to the nature of how films are, most films shot, which is as we were saying earlier, they're shot in this fragmented way, whereas maybe a week into shooting, there is a day where they shoot the beginning of the film and the end of the film.
Yeah.
And so you have to receive that information and imagine how that's going to work, even though all of the intermediate material has not been filmed yet. And so you have many things on the boil, which are influencing other and will continue to influence each other in this very extended process, very much unlike what the kind of work that you're doing, which is this live theater sort of experience. This is, if the film is being shot over 16 weeks, or in the case of Apocalypse Now, over 256 days, you have to kind of accommodate uh, that slowness into the way that you think.
Mm. How do you think, though, that we can give this, afford this to younger editors, given the kind of world that we live in terms of, the kind of, machine gun approach of information into our faces from our phones, but also schedules these days. Schedules seem to be a lot tighter and budgets seem to be a lot smaller. How can we kind of encourage people to make that kind of space?
I don't know. It's called personality also. So and things are changing. The what was the shooting process on adolescence? Well, that's a completely different thing. Where at least if going with what they say, they did a huge number of rehearsals of each scene. And then on the day of shooting or the days of shooting, they said go. And for 1 hour, they shot the movie. Every minute of shooting is a minute in the life of the film.
Mm.
And then at the end of that, they looked at whatever it was, 10 or 12 takes, and they said, that's the one.
Mm.
And that's the one that we saw. That's a completely different process. And somewhere in between is the process that Sam Mendes used on 1917.
Yeah.
It gives you the impression that it's all continuously one shot, but it was in fact broken down into a series of shots that were then digitally knitted together in order to look like it's continuous. So it's a moving target. It's a moving.
What's your thoughts on adolescence and I guess to a certain extent 1917 in terms of what a lack of editing does to our subconscious and how we can kind of read the situation? I mean, my experience watching adolescence is by the time you reach the finale and he's there in his son's bedroom holding his teddy bear, I was kind of in pieces. It really did affect me emotionally because you really felt like you'd been part of their lives for that period of time, and it had that same thing that a lingering shot might do, where you just start to feel a bit uncomfortable, and you just feel like what's your take on adolescence, do you think?
Truth in advertising here, I haven't seen Adolescence.
Right.
So I'm just responding to the phenomenon of it and the phenomenon of other films that present a continuous reality. It is great, I imagine, for the actors because they are in control of things to an extent that they certainly are not when we shoot film in the mosaic pattern, where we're shooting the end of the film and the beginning of the film on the same day. And what kind of emotional resources does that draw out of the actor? So on that level, it's good. I think it as a way of doing things, it's certainly valid. I'm giving a presentation in Paris at the Cinémathèque, and they asked for a title, and I said, it's in French, but I said, cinema without editing, is it cinema? So it's a provocative answer, and what I plan on saying, the first words out of my mouth are, of course it's cinema, but what is cinema that doesn't allow you to have the cut in Lawrence of Arabia from the match to the sunrise? That's a dream cut. And the difference, I guess, with adolescence is that it is not a dream in terms of those leaps of logic and surrealistic impositions that happen in dreams, happen in cinema. They happen in Lawrence of Arabia. And if you could say a magic wand and say, okay, from now on, all films will be shot like Adolescence, we would be cutting off some part of our anatomy to not have the ability to cut from the match to the sunrise.
Mm. It's interesting that it's still, adolescence still has to conform to many of the things we expect from cinema in terms of where the camera is positioned or where it settles, or or the transition from one to the other, like an over the shoulder shot in a conversation rather than cutting. Of course, it has to move to show that, and kind of changes the dynamic between the two individuals talking in that particular episode that's in just one room. We're never going to get away from those kind of those tropes in cinema, even if there isn't editing, I'm sure. And I like it as an experiment. I just don't necessarily see that it kind of fulfills me artistically. I enjoyed watching it. I thought it was interesting, but it seems like an anomaly rather than something that points to a future, let's say.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. In that sense, it's different but similar to 3D. For a while in 2009, we were thinking, oh, yeah, all cinema will now be 3D. Well, what happened? That isn't the case. Yeah. But there's a chapter or a heading in the book that says the cinematic cut cleaves the stone of time. And that's what cinema does with the invention of editing, is that time itself becomes manipulatable. And what adolescence does is deny that. It says, no, the 30th minute of this film is exactly 30 minutes from the beginning of the film. And it's valuable because it's this twilight zone between the theatrical experience and the cinematic experience. Francis Coppola wrote a book called Live Cinema a number of years ago that gets into this exact area, and it's some area that he was very interested in.
Do you know that was the same company that I talked about earlier that I work with, EVS. He did a white paper with EVS making a live show, like walking continuously through one door. He did some interesting things in that, where he would do a rehearsal where somebody had to open a window and shout something out the window, but before they rolled, he'd go and lock the window to kind of invoke a sort of instinctive response to the situation. So are you going to see Adolescence before you give your talk in Paris?
Yes, I will see it.
Yeah, good. You mentioned quite early on in the book about this particular moment where you're walking the streets of New York with George Lucas, somebody you've been friends with for many years, and seeing what you thought was an old colleague of yours, Carl Schultz, and then realizing it was not Carl, and then seeing Carl later on, or shortly after that. And it seems to be, this perfect metaphor for cinema's relationship to, expectation and misdirection. As an editor, I guess you're always constantly managing what the audience expects to see versus what they're actually seeing. Was that kind of a bit of an epiphany moment for you?
Yes. It was a mutual delusion in the sense that I was walking down 7th Avenue in New York in 1977, shortly after Star Wars had come out. I was in New York previewing Fred Zinnemann's film Julia, which we were in the process of locking, and ran into George we were at the same hotel, and we were ambling down 7th Avenue, and I looked ahead and saw, look, it's Carl Schultz, who was the general manager at Zoetrope 5 years earlier. And he had that job for 6 months or something. And in the intervening years, there was probably no reason for George or either of us, to think of him. But we both looked and said, yes, that's Carl. And we maintained that illusion until the kind of the last possible minute, when he was only 6 feet or 8 feet away from us, when he suddenly morphed into not Carl. all of the key parameters, his shirt, the kind of shirt that he wore, the way he walked, his beard, everything fit until he got so close that the details of this real person overwhelmed the details that we were projecting onto him. And there are many analogies to make with the process of filmmaking. There's that great quote from John Huston that says the real projectors are the eyes and ears of the audience, and that the film itself is just a pretext for that projection to take place. And in an ideal sense, I guess, we as editors want to control and anticipate the reactions of the audience, but not too much in advance or not too little in advance. Ideally it would be to kind of get them to have a sustained deja vu experience where they're feeling, I don't know what's going to happen next. And then it happens, and they said, of course, that's what had to happen. Mm-hmm. So there's a mixture of surprise and self-evidence that, if you have too much of either of those, then the audience gets bored. Mm-hmm. If everything is surprising, it's like chaos. If everything is self-evident, it's like, why am I watching this?
Yeah, it's a soap opera. The first time I had that sort of understanding of perception versus reality, I was in my 20s and I was walking up Victoria Street in London, and I was waiting at a crossing with a load of people on one side, load of people on the other side, and of course nobody had pushed the button to actually activate the crossing lights. But I remember looking across the road and I saw this school kid in a little cap and a blazer and shorts and kind of shiny patent leather shoes. And I looked at my watch thinking, oh yeah, it's 3:30 already. The day I kind of got away from it. All schools are chucking out. And just at that moment, a bus turned the corner heading down Horseferry Road, and it kind of wiped the frame. And instead of the kid, there was this like ancient Chinese woman standing exactly where this kid had been, wearing a little hat and a blazer and shorts and little patent shoes. And I actually sort of staggered backwards. I couldn't believe that my mind had tricked me into thinking this was a school kid. But in the same way that, you saw the gait and the shirt of Carl, I saw what I assumed was a school kid because it was that time. It kind of fit with the parameters of where I was. And yeah, it really changed my sort of understanding of how we can be fooled and how our vision really is perception. It's not, it's not accurate, let's say. And of course, that lends itself to many of the things that you've done in the industry in terms of, trying to kind of misdirect people and change expectations. Not a question, just a statement.
The weird thing about the Carl experience is that I wouldn't have remembered any of this with the exception that George and I walked for another block and then we turned right and bumped into the real Carl Schultz.
Which is insane.
And it was so much of a hole-in-one that you kind of accepted it as, well, of course, this had to happen.
Yeah.
Oh, Carl, we were just thinking about you. Had we turned left instead of right, we wouldn't have bumped into Carl, and I wouldn't be retelling this story, let alone writing it as the first chapter of a book.
Yeah, it's crazy that even the fact that you and George bumped into each other at that point, in a way, but we accept those kind of coincidences. But then having this shared experience of both thinking it was Carl and then seeing Carl, it just kind of boggles the mind. There are many mysteries that we still don't understand, and that's what I've always liked about your writing as well. You can have, like I said earlier, like a practical tip that works for you, but you also kind of acknowledge that a lot of this is still mysterious. We can continue to try and pin these things down, but we still have to acknowledge that, we're probably not going to reach a point where we can pin everything down.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. I also like that early sort of mention in the book about the fresco versus oil painting analogy, analog versus digital. It really stuck with me. The fresco sort of being, immediate and irreversible to a certain extent, but then oil paintings being more adjustable. Do you think that sort of flexibility that we have with digital now has improved the storytelling, or has it sort of weakened our instincts?
Hard to say. Hard to say. I mean, in comparison, of course, even mechanical analog editing, there was a lot of the oil painting in that,
Mm,
in that you could change things. It was more awkward than it is now,
mm,
and it took time to work it out and to physically do it. But we could swap out shots. We could make reel two become reel one.
mm, mm,
Uh, it's all relative to the film that you're working on, I think. But as I said, we're now 3 decades
mm,
into digital filmmaking, and we're at the brink of this new experience with AI, which is both a continuation of digital. It's enabled obviously by digitization,
mm,
but at the same time, we're going to find surprises in there that we haven't anticipated. You you could obviously with AI, you can make a film without any edits in it.
mhm,
Um, so is that good? Who knows?
mm. Yeah, that's my kind of worry about AI in a way, is that it kind of removes that spontaneity that we have as humans. And I spoke to a couple of people on this podcast who had very kind of different views, not necessarily a question about AI, but one of the designers, Nilo Rodis Jamiro, who worked with Lucas, um, sort of talks about, there's nothing more daunting than that white page and, a pencil, or in his case, a pen in his hand, and just having to draw a form and just letting the form kind of mutate into something. Whereas then I spoke to Nathan Crowley, as a production designer who just won the Oscar for Wicked. He uses AI to kind of leapfrog that iterative process to get to a place quicker. Um, but in a way, I guess he kind of questions whether he's losing something by leapfrogging. But I guess ultimately a lot of it comes down to these days, as I mentioned earlier, budget and schedule and all of those things. But there's no right or wrong way to do it, I guess. But I do wonder if, even if AI could mimic spontaneity, I don't know if we'd even accept it as real. I don't know. There's still that uncanny valley thing going on.
Yeah, the great, but at the same time, the awkward thing about filmmaking is that it's such a collaborative art.
Mm,
Every one of the people who works on a film, particularly the heads of departments, has a vision, some of which is articulate, some of which is not, of what this film is going to look like and feel like. And those are frequently at slight odds with the vision of the director.
mm,
More power to it, because what that does, if harnessed correctly, is those slight differences add facets to the diamond of the film,
mm,
which allows the light of consciousness to bounce around in it, because they're all slightly contradictory. But that's like life. If it's all the product of a single human mind, there's a kind of airlessness that the danger of that is this conceptual airlessness, which is this is everything that I conceived exactly the way that I wanted it to achieve. On the other hand, that's kind of the way digital animation is done. In a sense,
mm,
every pic in a Pixar film has been consciously or unconsciously blessed. That
true.
and to the extent that in later versions they've tried to introduce mistakes,
Yeah.
artificial mistakes into the process.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there was nothing like the reality of a conflict between the vision of the production designer and the vision of the director and the vision of the cinematographer, and the vision of the actor, all kind of a swirling around. A great example of that is in Godfather,
Mm,
when Gordy Willis saw the makeup that was being done, he, to by his own admission. He said, "This is a disaster. How can I work with this?" And his solution was to light from above, so that the eyes were cast into shadow. I mean, you can see this brilliantly in the opening scenes of The Godfather in the office, right? Um, and when Al Pacino saw this lighting, he didn't have much experience in film at that point, and he said, "What is this weird lighting?" But that choice of that weird lighting gave him an insight into his character, which is, my character is being followed by a spotlight, the spotlight of fate from above, and I'm constantly, as a character, trying to get out of that spotlight. I don't want to be part of this family, and spotlight would find him again, and then he'd have to find a way to get away from it again, and it would find him again until finally he got into the mat, and he became the Godfather, rather than, he completely failed at getting out of the family, but, to almost 180-degree opposite. He became who he was trying to escape. That was all an interaction of the makeup choices, the lighting choices, and the acting choices. But those were three different people. Dick Smith did the makeup. Yeah. Gordy Willis did the photography, and Al Pacino was the actor.
Yeah, we're not going to have that when we just write a text prompt. There is a chapter in the book that isn't written by you, and it's Paul Hirsch, former guest on this podcast as well. I had a great time chatting to Paul about the Droid Olympics. And that's something I only found out about recently, relatively recently. I think it was in Michael Rubin's book, Droid Maker, where he talks about Lucas's work. And kind of rare for editors to be, well, A, together, B, and outside. They sounded like some fun times that you had there doing those events.
Yeah, it was triggered by the fact that my wife had just put on a gymkhana with kids riding horses and, doing all these slightly dangerous and slightly silly things and getting blue ribbons as a result. And I was editing Apocalypse at the time. This was 1978. And my assistant, who 90% of the time was reconforming daily roles, which is about as mind-numbing an experience as possible, but you have to pay great attention to it. And to relieve his frustration, he somehow got hold of a superhero character at the time called Stretch, who was a plastic man type person, and he had put wire on Stretch's hands and feet, and then clamped Stretch into the synchronizing machine, rewinding back and forth. And I said, "Steve, what are you doing?" And he said, "Stretch has to suffer." And that's when I thought, okay, these guys need some fresh air. So we set up out at our house in the country, just north of San Francisco, the Droid Decathlon, the Droid Olympics. We called it Droid because that's what all of the editorial assistants on Apocalypse called themselves, because they felt they were just robots doing this reconforming all the time. And so how fast can you do a splice? How fast can you rewind 1,000 feet? How accurate is your sense of time to blindfolded stop a moviola exactly 45 feet from the beginning? Those kind of things. And, everyone got a medal who won. And then there was a super quality who, got the most points. So, and we did it 3 times, I think, the 78 and 82 and then 87, I think. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of like what happens in lumberjacking contests, where you do all of these old type lumberjack events, that nobody does anymore.
Mm.
They're very visual and visceral experiences that are they're denied us in the digital world.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. How can we get editors outside and kind of a chance to kind of vent? Maybe there isn't an answer to that. In part two of the book, you talk about sound design, and how sound went from this kind of, powerful king in its inception in cinema to often being forgotten about because there's a sort of thought that it's inevitable and therefore it's an afterthought. Do you think that, cinema during that transition kind of suffered in that regard as to where and how film ends up or sound ends up in a film?
Yeah, it was particularly the case when I started working professionally, because of something that this was in the late 60s, early 70s, but because of something that had happened in the early 50s. The sound was still reeling from that experience, which was the transition from optical to magnetic sound.
Mm.
And in 1952, let's say, when that transition was in full force, sound had been around for 25 years. I think the math is correct, from 47 to 52. And so many of the guys who started film sound were near retirement age, and they looked at magnetic sound and they said, I'm out of here. I don't want to make this leap. And so there was a crisis. This is in Hollywood, where doors that had been firmly closed in terms of union representation were suddenly open. Anyone who wants to can become a sound editor now because of all of this mass retirement. And so a lot of people went into film sound, not everyone by any means, but a lot went in simply to get a union job, which was like a miracle that's opening up. And then when the roster had been completed, there was the clanging of the door shut, and a lot of people realized, I'm not really interested in sound. I just wanted a regular job. And so there was a period where sound was kind of low on the totem pole as a result. It was just something that had to be done. But very few people put a lot of heart and soul into it, comparatively speaking. And by the early 70s, that in turn was beginning to change, I guess, and I represented the next generation of people who really thought sound could be great, that it was an unexplored area. And we stormed the barricades trying to force it to be better than it was. And then thankfully along came Dolby and made this technical leap so that the experience in the 1950s, say, was that unless you were going to a big road show of a film with 70 millimeter with magnetic sound, you were listening to films that sounded exactly the same as Gone with the Wind in 1939. There had been no technical advance. And then suddenly with Dolby, there was this leap. But in the 50s, you could listen to an LP and hear the full sonic range from whatever it was, 40 cycles per second to 16,000. But you go to the cinema and you couldn't hear anything more than 8,000 cycles. And Dolby fixed that. Thank goodness.
I often think with sound, I was thinking this as I was reading part of the sound chapter this morning, similar to the way visual effects has tried to replicate life and be photorealistic, it feels to me sometimes that sound is thought of in the same way by some practitioners, and that they're not really using sound to its fullest extent, in terms of its power of using it in a metaphorical way to invoke a certain emotional response. Rather, they seem to be layering sounds to such an extent that we just end up with that sort of muddled confusion that we have in life, where there are footsteps and there's a plane going over and a bus going by. But do you feel that sometimes that is forgotten about, the kind of way we can use sound in a metaphorical sense to evoke those emotional responses?
The film reviewer, presently, he was at the LA Times, he's at the New Yorker now, forgetting his first name, David Chang something.
Mm-hmm.
He said, a film can be so realistic that you don't believe a moment of it.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the essence of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it just goes back to the dreamscape that we were talking about earlier, that in dreams, the thing that makes dreams memorable is what was going on there?
Yeah.
This is weird. And so what I try to do in sound is use, as you put it, use sound metaphorically, which is to say, you're looking at an image and the sound you're hearing does not seem naturally to go with that image. And so it poses a question to the audience, and the person sitting in the audience, consciously or unconsciously, completes the circle. It's kind of a gestalt moment where what's implied is rendered complete by the imagination of the viewer.
Mm.
The miracle and greatness of that is that everyone will complete that question in a slightly different way, and then they project that completion onto the screen, imagining that it comes from the screen, but it's not. It's kind of like us seeing Carl Schultz. We project Carl onto this screen of reality. Anyway, but as a result of that, the film talks to you in a way that seems very personal, because you have projected yourself into the film to resolve certain questions that the film is posing to you, editorially, or in terms of script, or in terms of the acting performance, and in terms of sound. The classic example for me was the roaring of the train in Godfather.
Yeah.
Was not in the screenplay. It wasn't in the book. It came about as the result of the fact that Francis and Nino Rota had decided they were going to have a big music cue after the killing, so they didn't want any music leading up to it, no suspense music. But the scene is in a foreign language, a third of it, with no subtitles. So it needs something. And because of where I grew up in New York, I knew that the Bronx had these elevated trains. So let's put the sound of an elevated train. There must be one in that neighborhood. And it comes and goes and comes and goes and builds in intensity until it starts screeching in the moments before Michael pulls out the gun and shoots Sollozzo. But the audience, some people in the audience don't even hear that sound. They interpret it as what's going on inside Michael's head, because making up. He's trying to decide, should I really kill this person at point blank range? One of the nice, mostly unremarked twists is that Clemenza, in a couple of scenes previous, said, once you've got the gun, come out of the bathroom blasting. In other words, he said, as soon as you come out, start shooting. But Michael doesn't. He comes out, stands there for a few seconds, and then comes and sits down. And so the question the audience is asking is, well, is he not going to do? What's going on? And then the sound comes in and it intensifies the moment. Anyway, that's a metaphorical sound that is based in some reality.
Yeah, and as I think I heard you say in a lecture in North London once, and I think we might have talked about it previously, in a sort of Carl Schultz coincidence, there was actually an L train right outside that shooting location as well.
Right. I got a great email from the sound recordist on Godfather who said he went to see the film um, in Minnesota. He was visiting relatives and he heard the sound of the train and he thought, WTF. I there was the train and I did everything to get rid of the train. What's happening? And then, of course, he began to realize with the rising intensity that it was put there on purpose. But yeah, as it turns out, that they're just outside the door of this real restaurant was an elevated train track, and which I didn't know. It's on a real Carl Schultz moment. Um, uh, and in the shooting of the scene, they were doing everything they could to try to squeeze in dialogue between the passing of the train.
Amazing. I love just how all the confluence of all those different things coming together to make that what it is. This is a bit of a weird aside. I spoke to a live television sound supervisor recently, and usually when I chat to them, I ask them about what kind of sound setup do they have at home, and is there a favorite cinema of theirs they like to go to. But this particular guy said, "Oh, I've never understood surround sound. Cinema and TV is a flat medium." What are your thoughts on what surround sound actually does to the audience, so I can go back armed with a good answer to that kind of flippant throwaway comment?
I mean, it was particularly pungent, aromatic question when we were mixing Apocalypse Now, because none of us working on the film had ever worked in stereo, let alone stereo with surround, let alone surround that was split stereophonically. We were creating what is now known as 5.1 sound, but we had all worked in mono. So we were simultaneously excited and petrified by the working in this new format. So we came up with a list of do's and don'ts. Don't do this, try to do this. One of the don'ts is don't put any dialogue into the surrounds unless the scene is completely chaotic, such as the Playboy Bunny concert. When that gets intense, then there's some dialogue that creeps in. You can put a little reverb of the dialogue into the surrounds. Those kind of decisions. But I don't know, as an example, if I, this is just personal, if I have a sound that is fading in and is going to become loud, when it fades in, I keep it in the center as mono, because center is a neutral place. None of the spatial neurons are being activated. As it gets louder, and this is just a creative, intuitive moment, at a certain point, I will put it where it should be in terms of the image, to the left, say, or left back or something. And then as it gets even louder still, then I will move it in the direction of whatever the sound might be doing. And then as it fades out, I bring it back to the center again, which is this neutral point, and fade it out. So those kind of things are happening. There's a weird example of this where I kept running into it, and then it really became pointed there's a scene in Cold Mountain. They're having a party, and Stobrod is playing the violin, and he's moving around the scene, and people are talking and playing an instrument at the same time. And what worked was to put the dialogue only in the center, even though the person is on the left side of the screen. So the dialogue is coming out of the center only, but the sound of the violin is moving left and right depending on where he's going. So you get this complete paradox moment where the violin, Stobrod is over on the left-hand side. The violin is on the left, but his dialogue is coming out of the center, and it seems absolutely normal. In fact, it would seem wrong if we put his dialogue over there. So what's going on? I think it's because music is experienced directly. It's not a code that you have to break. It's a sound pure in itself, whereas dialogue has to go through the language part of your brain to code it. What is he saying? And then you understand it. But that's a very complex pattern. And so basically the brain says, as far as dialogue goes, I will ascribe source to where the image is because it's too complicated for me to decode the language and assign sources to it. So those kind of stuff. And if you just use those kind of decisions and extend them into the complexity of surround, it begins to get at the nature of the craziness of this medium. But I'm slightly suspicious. I'm 82, so or almost. Atmos to me is a bridge too far, because we are looking at the screen. It is, even in 3D, it's two-dimensional in the sense that we're in a box and one wall of that box is luminous. So we're oriented that way. And you have to be careful about pulling attention to the behind. There's a great cartoon in the book at the beginning of the sound thing where there's a person screaming and in the audience around looking what he's screaming at. Of course, nobody does that when watching movies unless the scream is coming from the surround. And it would turn around, but then that just reminds you that you're in a box watching a painted wall, and you don't want that to happen. You want people to be immersed in the world of the film.
So my colleague Dave was kind of right in a certain way, I guess. I'll play him your answer to that.
Yeah.
I was delighted to read that there's going to be a second volume of the book, and you talk about, can cinema solve our problems? What can we expect in volume 2? Is it going to have the same title and just be volume 2, or is there a new title of the book?
Well, actually, the original conception, which is still to be revealed, is that it was 3 volumes. Suddenly, something clicked. The second volume is focused on production, which is to say, writing. I include that in the process: writing, casting, directing, and there's a section on my own experiences directing Return to Oz, and what was involved in making that film. The fact that I was fired 6 weeks into production and then rehired a few days later, and why did that happen, and how did I Houdini-like escape from eternal punishment. So that's volume 2. Let's say volume 3 gets into even some more philosophical things, which is where are we going with cinema? The fact that actually 2025 is the 200th anniversary of motion pictures, in the sense that the thaumatrope, which was this simple 2-image device, was invented in 1825, and then the zoetrope, phenakistoscope, they came along in the 1830s, and so here we are 200 years later. Are we going to continue to evolve, or or are we going to be diverted into this artificial intelligence path. And how does cinema deal with the fact that among all the arts, it's the one that accesses more parts of the brain than any of the other arts? That cinema, because of its visceral nature, using image and sound, can directly address let's call it the brainstem part of us, the instant reaction to something, the so-called reptilian part of our behavior, fight or flight. The middle part of the brain, which is mainly mammalian in evolution, is the fact that we suckle our young, and we educate our young, some more than others, but that's a notable difference from most reptiles who simply have babies and let them go out into the world. So the emotional component of mammals is very different than reptiles, and that's part of us, obviously, and film can directly access the emotional part. It has to, really, in order to have an effect. But then there's this other part, which is the logical part, the neocortex, the linguistic part of our brain that says, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. He wouldn't have grabbed the knife before seeing her, because she knows that, all of those kind of if-then clauses where you can lose an audience because of a logical contradiction. So there's a plea, I guess, to say film at its maximum, pushed to its fullest, it can, in a symphonic way or a novelistic way, it can simultaneously talk to and choreograph the reactions from all these different parts of the brain. And most of the time, when we're in our ordinary life, those three parts of the brain are talking to each other, but they're usually in some kind of conflict. I don't know what came over me. Why did I do that? Kind of things. But a film allows for the duration of the film, if it's a well-made film and if it has ambition, it can choreograph those three different areas, and we come out of the film transformed in a way because of that experience. It's similar to what happens in a well-written symphonic situation, any piece of music, but symphony is relevant because so many people are involved. You don't want all of the instruments to be playing the same thing all of the time. You want the violins to be having one sort of discussion, and the woodwinds are saying, yes, but something else. Then the timpani are doing something else yet again. And that's, the wonderful thing about those experiences when they work is that dialogue that's going on. There's a great line in the book, I forget which chapter it's in, where Mike Nichols says, when I go to a party, what's interesting to me is to watch people. They're doing one thing, they're saying something else, and they're thinking something else yet again. And film has the ability to choreograph that you can have an actor say, I love you, to the girl, but he says it in a way that says, I don't really love you. It can be photographed in a way that says, but he really does. You get this interweaving of these three things, and those areas are just very provocative and exciting, and reveal the depth and possibilities of cinema when it's pushed to the wall. And I mean that in a positive sense, where you're straining every sinew to deliver what cinema can deliver at its best. And by no means should all cinema be that way. And it would be intolerable if every cinematic experience was like that. You want the equivalent of Chopin preludes in cinema, where it's just we're examining one thing, and it's my dinner with Andre or whatever. God bless it. It's a smorgasbord of different things. But at the same time, what I was trying to investigate was just answer the question: what is it that it can deliver, like no other art form? And certainly, Richard Wagner in opera had this idea of the total artwork, in German Gesamtkunstwerk.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure had he been born 100 years later, he would have been a filmmaker. There's another chapter, a series of chapters, actually. Again, I was very surprised to be writing about this, but it happened, which was um, the uncanny persistence of framing that puts the eyes of the actors in close-up along the golden ratio of the vertical dimension of the frame. And I try to demonstrate that this is in fact true and has been true for at least 100 years, if not longer, and then try to answer the question, why is this? And what I came up with is that it has to do with the main features of the human face being in a golden ratio, that the line through the eyes compared to the line through the nose compared to the line through the lips, that is a golden ratio, and it also applies to the hairline and the chin.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it gets into those kind of areas.
What I like about the book as well is that you've got these QR codes throughout, which are links to some of the videos that you've made and clips from things that you're talking about. So we're able to sort of read your understanding, your explanations, but then see them have a visual representation of them. I really enjoyed the chapter in which you talk about rearranging the conversation and just what scenes were missing, which weren't shot, and how you had to reconfigure the film to kind of make sense of it. Is that something you're going to continue through the next few volumes?
Yeah, no, the other volume, everything is written. It's just waiting to be published.
Okay.
So.
Okay, cool. Well, any film nerd friends of mine listening that have birthdays coming up soon, this is going to be their gift. I love the book, Walter, and I really appreciate you and what you do, and I really appreciate you giving your time today to talk to me about the new book.
Right, absolutely. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Walter. That was the brilliant Walter Murch, and what a pleasure it is every single time I get to chat to him. I'm really grateful to Faber Faber for the early copy of Suddenly Something Clicked, which, as I mentioned, is out on the 8th of May 2025. If you're a film lover or just fascinated by how we see and hear cinema, I highly recommend picking it up. It's fantastic. I finished it and then I just started it again. And we've got more volumes to come, which is exciting news. Thanks for joining me again on this 125th episode, and for 5 years of Filmumentaries. Whether you've listened to a handful of episodes or you've been here since the start, I truly appreciate it. And, it's been a genuine joy to share these behind-the-scenes stories with you. And there's plenty more to come. Please support the podcast. I need at least 100 more patrons of you to do so to make this financially viable. Otherwise, it's just a hobby that stops me from spending time with my family. Patreon.com/Jamie Benning. I hope you enjoyed the recent bonus episodes with Vicky Sampson talking about the day some vital Return of the Jedi reels got stolen from her car, and also the bonus episodes from Rachel Pearson reporting some news from the floor of Star Wars Celebration Tokyo. So the next location for Star Wars Celebration has been announced as LA, and it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the first Star Wars, or Star Wars as I call it. Maybe I'll go. Maybe I'll find a way of doing something for ILM again. That would be fantastic. I'd love to do that. Another panel maybe, or maybe present something. We'll see. But thank you to both those amazing women, Vicky and Rachel, for their contributions on those bonus episodes. Okay, the big news that I promised at the start of the episode here. You may have already seen that an original 1977 dye transfer print of Star Wars is being screened here in London at the BFI. It's on the 12th of June, And tickets can be bought on the following dates, so listen up. So if you're a BFI patron, which you're probably not, that's Tuesday the 6th of May from 12 o'clock. You can buy tickets. If you're a BFI member, it's Wednesday the 7th of May from midday. I would say get a membership. It's not that expensive, and it will mean you've got a much better chance of getting the tickets. They're going to go very, very quickly, I'm sure. So yeah, BFI members, Wednesday the 7th of May. And then the general sale is Friday the 9th of May from midday. By then, I would imagine that quite a lot of tickets will have gone. So, and I'm very pleased to say that my friend and previous podcast guest, Doug Weir, we're going to do something related, is all I'll say, on the same day as the screening at the BFI. We're just finalising things, so there'll be more details in the coming days and weeks, but it's exciting. As always, you can find more info about my films, the podcast, and anything else Filmumentaries at filmumentaries.com. In fact, you can sign up there for a monthly newsletter so that you don't miss a thing. I'll be back with another great guest on the 13th of May. In the meantime, enjoy Light and Magic Season 2. That's just come out this week, and it's fantastic. It's only 3 episodes, but Joe Johnston and the team have done a great job. I ended up sending Joe an email just to thank him, and also to Rob Coleman as well, to say it was great to see him featured so heavily. I spoke to Rob recently for an article that I'm currently writing for ILM. Really good guy, really good energy, and just a sweet man as well, and also super talented, of course. More to come, as always. Lots of interviews lined up. Hopefully trying to get a few more bonus episodes going this year as well. In the meantime, take care. Thanks again for listening. 5 more years, 5 more years, 5 more years. This podcast is produced and edited by me, Jamie Benning. Music is by Michael Hewitt-Brown of MB Music. 5 more years.
Weirding Way Media.